I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts. Welcome back to the Night Sky Sew Along. Today we're going to go over options for quilting and binding. Night Sky is a borderless quilt, and as such, the binding can play an important design role. You can choose binding that blends in by choosing binding that matches your background fabric. In this case, it will disappear and not be a design that your eye focuses on. Or alternatively, you can choose a binding that is different from your background and it will pop and create a miniature border of sorts. There are lots of options for quilting as well, so let's get started. Binding, as I've mentioned, can be an accent design or it can blend in and match your background. I chose this stripe because it creates a miniature border on the front of this quilt. With the backing, I chose a large scale wide back so that I wouldn't have to piece it, and it's a great place to display a print such as this. There's no right or wrong choice when it comes to deciding on the fabric that you want to use to bind your quilt. It all just depends on your personal choice. This baby quilt that I made for the sew along was edge to edge quilted by Teresa Silva of Quilting is My Bliss. We selected the swirl design, Dizzy Izzy, for the pantograph. It helps to soften the edges of the sharp geometry that exists in the quilt. The other Night Sky quilts in my collection have all been custom quilted by Teresa or Angela Walters of Quilting is My Therapy. The geometry of the quilt tops is the foundation for the quilting choices that they made when quilting these quilts. This Night Sky sample was quilted by Teresa Silva of Quilting is My Bliss. In the background, she quilted 3-pointed asterisks, and then she filled in with geometric designs and swirls. In the blocks, she did point-to-point quilting and echoed that to accentuate the geometry of the star. The approach of quilting within the stars to emphasize their design and then creating a secondary design in the background is a feature of my Night Sky quilts that were all custom quilted by Angela Walters. In this quilt, the original pattern cover quilt, the stars are filled with point-to-point designs. The background is anchored with connecting straight lines that create a border around the stars. Then swirls are used to fill in the gaps created by the straight lines that outline the stars. This quilt features echoing point to point as well as petals in the star diamonds and plumes in the star points. The background is filled with a mix of more plume feathers and dense line quilting. With this quilt in my wedding colors, Angela did point-to-point quilting in the diamonds and petals in the star points. She then did straight line trails between the blocks and finished by densely quilting swirls and plumes in all the spaces between. And finally, my Tula Pink Fox Field Night Sky quilt. These blocks also have the hallmark point-to-point and petal designs in the diamonds and the star points. The background is then filled with these retro star-like asterisks connecting the blocks, and then the rest of the background is filled in with densely quilted swirls between the asterisks. Now that we have gone over options for quilting and binding, it's time that I bind my quilt. As mentioned, this has a pantograph, and the next step, now that it has been quilted, is to trim the quilt top so that I can put the binding on. So one thing to note when trimming a quilt top that doesn't have borders and has points is to make sure that the distance from your point to where you trim is the same as what you're going to sew your binding on. For most people, that's 1/4 inch. If you're going to do a more generous binding, make sure that you trim accordingly. Since I'm going to do a 1/4 inch, I'm just going to make sure that I'm trimming a 1/4 inch away from this point. And that should be my raw edge, but it isn't always, so it's good to just double check, take a look at things. There we go. And I would continue this process along the length there. I'm going to show you what I do with these sharp points. I'm going to go ahead and use my rotary cutter to trim close into there, but not all the way into the point. I don't want to accidentally use my rotary cutter to cut into my project. I'm also going to make sure that I'm cutting away from myself instead of towards myself, so there's less of a chance of that happening. So I'm going to line my ruler up, and about an inch or so away, I'm going to cut. And I'm going to turn. I'm going to make sure I stop an inch away. Don't want to cut into my project. And then to cut the rest of this, I'm just going to use scissors. We have a little more control with scissors. Can get a nice sharp point in there without risking cutting into our actual quilt top. And there you go. And I'll repeat this process around the entire quilt. The next step is to choose my binding. And as mentioned, we have lots of choices here. Our first choice is to use the same fabric that we've used in our background. And that would just add a small amount here, and you would mostly see it where the half blocks reach the edge of the quilt. So that's what that would look like. I often like to take my fabric like this, place it under my quilt to kind of audition my binding before going ahead and cutting fabric. This is a good way to kind of tell. So that's a pink. That looks nice. It's similar print to the background, but it's a color that I didn't use in here. Might be a little bit too bubblegum for this one for my liking. And then we have this, which is one of the fabrics in the quilt. I like that. It definitely pops and would create a small frame around, but I'm not sure if I like that it would touch itself in the quilt. I went through a few options, and I actually found some leftover binding from another project that is an orange and pink stripe. And it's not the perfect match of orange and pink, but it is Tula, and it does seem to kind of give what I want. It has a nice little pop, and it's already bias cut. This quilt requires bias cut binding. And the reason for that is when we get to these inside corners, we're going to be stretching this a little bit and stretching our binding, and it requires that we have bias cut binding. So I'm going to go ahead and use this to bind my quilt. So let's head on over to the sewing machine. Sewing the binding on a quilt with 60-degree corners is very similar to sewing binding on a quilt with 90-degree corners with just a few changes. If you went ahead and squared off the corners of your night sky quilt, go ahead and bind it as you would any quilt with 90-degree corners. If you followed the pattern and you have 60-degree outside and inside corners, go ahead and follow what I'm going to show you here. For the purposes of demonstration, I have dark thread in my machine so that you'll be able to see exactly how we're going to miter our corners. I suggest using thread that matches your binding or your quilt when sewing your binding on. We're going to begin in the middle of one of the straight sides, and I'm going to go ahead and leave a tail of about 8 inches. And then I have my machine set to a 1/4 inch. Just going to do a little bit of a back stitch. And I'm just going to sew with all my raw edges together, my 1/4 inch seam, till I get to a 1/4 inch, and I'll show you when we get close. So I want here to have an imaginary line, and sometimes it can help to actually draw that line. So I'm going to grab a pencil and a ruler. I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line with my pencil. And that line is just a continuation of here coming to that point. And I'm going to stop when I get to that line and do a couple back stitches. Nice and slow so I get exactly to the right point. Okay. So as you can see, I now have sewn to that line, done a couple back stitches. Now I want to take my fabric, and normally we fold it 90 degrees, 90 degrees, we keep sewing along. Since I have a 60-degree turn here, what I want to do is I want to take my fabric and I want to fold it away from where I'm going so that I have a straight line here, and then back onto my piece. And so the miter looks a little different than what you're used to. This piece does not currently line up with this piece, but this will give you the perfect amount of fabric to create a nice miter. So we're just going to turn it and go back under the machine. Make sure I'm sewing forward and not backward. And again, you can eyeball this when you start to feel comfortable, but it can be helpful to just take your ruler, make a quick little line. We're going to sew to that line. And backstitch. And we're going to do the same fold that we just did in the previous corner, and then I'm going to show you how we do an inside corner. Okay, so my next corner is an inside corner, and the one thing I want to do before I get too close to my machine is I'm actually going to snip a little bit here. I want to only go 1/8 of an inch though, because my binding is going to be sewn on at 1/4 of an inch. I just want enough that I'll be able to spread this apart a little bit. So very carefully cut 1/8 of an inch in so that you'll be able to open it like this. Not the full quarter, just 1/8. And continue to sew this. Now I'm getting close to that point. And what I want to do is I want to sew until I get onto this seam. And I want to stop with my needle down. I'll show you what that looks like. Now, if you would like to draw that line ahead of time to know where to stop, it works for this angle as well as the outsides. Now, with my needle down, I'm going to pull to make this somewhat straight. It won't go exactly straight, but I'm going to kind of gather up my quilt on the inside here so that I want to line up my binding with my raw edge here. That's what I'm looking at, is keeping this binding lined up here as much as possible. And this is where it's really helpful when it's bias. And very slowly, a couple stitches at a time, I'm going to sew. And before I get too far, I'm actually going to stop and I'm going to check. It's easiest to redo this now if it doesn't look good before I continue sewing. So this is what it's going to look like. Okay, on the inside, and then when it flips over, that's what it looks like. And there we go. Gonna have a nice inside corner. Continue this process on the outside and inside corners to sew the rest of your binding to your quilt. Then it's time to wrap it to the back. I'm going to take some Wonder Clips to help hold it in place. And I'll show you how I get my neat mitered corners. So after I've stuck a few clips in, what you want to do is give this a light little bit of a tug, and you should have a nice little miter there that goes right into your quilt. And you want to do what I call split the bulk, which means on our front, our bulk is here on the left, and so we want our bulk in the back to be over here. So if we fold this side first, followed by this side, we have what's called split the bulk. So I'm going to go ahead and put a clip in. I'll show that to you again. So again, we're just going to give it a nice little bit of a tug, and I'll show you what it would look like if we didn't split the bulk. If I flip this side first and then this side, what's going to happen is all my bulk is going to be here on the left, and it's just kind of clunky. So it just looks better when you have it split. And one thing to note on the back, obviously you'll have matching threads here, but one thing to note on the back is you don't want to fully tuck your binding, because then you're going to have this little bit of a gap. When we do 90s, we fully tuck that miter in, but with 60s, you're just tucking it in a little bit, and you want to tuck it until these meet up right here. And when they do, go ahead and put a clip in. And then for our inside corner, similar process. I'm going to start by putting a clip on either side of it. And I want to make sure it looks really good on this side. So I'm just going to lightly tug it over. And because of how we sewed it on and stretched our bias a little bit, it looks great on the front and on the back. So I'm going to change the thread in my machine, go ahead, finish putting my binding on, and then it's time to hand stitch this, and you can do that using your favorite hand stitching method. Thanks so much for tuning in here today. If you've enjoyed this video and this series, please be sure to like it, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comments with us. You can also turn on notifications to receive an alert every time we publish a new video. Also, if you've enjoyed this sew along, we would love it if you would join us for the next one. The Quilts for Baby and Beyond sew along starts in the next few weeks. You can find the link to sign up below in the description. I would love to keep sewing with you. Thanks so much for joining us for this sew along, and we're looking forward to the next one. See you soon.